Okay. All right. So we're up and running. Excellent. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Mental Health Minute. So my name is Terry Sunstegen Burns, and I am the team lead for Project Renew. And today, what we're going to talk about is disaster recovery and the impacts that disaster has on us. And specifically, we're going to talk about how the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted us and continues to impact us, and how we can mitigate some of those impacts. So we're just going to jump right in here. So this image here comes from SAMHSA, and it's called the Stages of Disaster Recovery. And there's quite a lot to unpack here, so we're going to go through it together, and we're going to use a tornado as our example for this. So we have our pre-disaster phase. This is our warning period. So this is where it's a warm day, the weather seems to change fairly quickly, the sky looks a little bit green, and we think, oh, that's not good. Then we have our threat. The sirens go off. So we take shelter, and then there's the impact. The tornado hits us. After the tornado passes, we move into our heroic phase. So we go outside, we survey the damage, we help our neighbours move tree branches, and we start to mobilise an initial response. So we have this moment here of community cohesion where everyone kind of pulls together to take care of needs. And this is where we have church halls being used to make sandwiches and people gathering donations to help people fulfill their immediate needs, right? And then you can see we sort of slide into disillusionment. There's a lot of work to do. Insurance doesn't cover everything, and we feel the emotional impacts of the disaster. And we have trigger events in the disillusionment phase. So maybe an application for assistance is denied, or we find out that a location that's special to us was damaged, or that someone we know was hurt during the tornado. And these trigger events tend to be our low points. And then around we start to improve a little bit, and then around the anniversary we have another dip as we remember the disaster, and then it's a slow, mostly upwards trajectory from there. So this is a pretty streamlined process, and this isn't always how it works. It doesn't have to follow a linear pattern. We can have setbacks, we can skip steps. It can start to resemble a game of snakes and ladders, and that's fairly common. But this is how it would go if everything was textbook. So now let's talk about COVID. And I know we're all kind of sick of talking about COVID-19, but it's been a pretty unique disaster. So our old friend comes back here. Now, with a typical disaster, we enter the pre-disaster phase at roughly the same time as everyone else in our community. And that really wasn't the case with COVID. So we have people moving through these stages at completely different times. So personally, I'm an infectious disease nerd. I do a lot of reading on infectious disease. My husband doesn't let me tell him about the books I'm reading. So for me, my warning period started really, really early. So it started second week of January when we started seeing cases of pneumonia coming out of Wuhan. And I thought, oh, that's interesting, and started following it. So for me, my warning phase started really, really early. A lot of people's warning phase didn't really start until several weeks later when we started to see cases outside of China, when we started to see the first cases in the US, when we started to see the cruise ship outbreaks. And that was when most people started going, oh, hold on here. For most of us, I think the threat stage was probably pretty similar. I think most of us probably went, oh, hang on here, right around the time where we just suddenly couldn't find toilet paper or cleaning supplies anywhere. And then impact for most of us is probably about the same. So most likely the first 2 weeks of March. So that was around the time our stay-at-home orders came out. We got sent home. Oh, go back. We got sent home to work. Our kids got sent home from school. Things really started to shut down. So we had this heroic stage where we sewed masks for each other, and we really had the sense that we were all in it together. And then we began our slow slide into disillusionment. So the unique thing about COVID is it's had multiple impacts for each of us. And the impacts are often more intense than a typical trigger event. So if we got sick ourselves, or if a loved one got sick, or we lost our jobs, it's really, really hard to make the argument that that's a trigger event rather than a second or third or fourth impact. And after each of those impacts, because they're happening independently, because they're happening to us personally, we're not seeing the same level of community cohesion. So we're going through this disaster response completely out of sync with the other people around us. And everyone around us is getting their own series of impacts. So the other thing that's pretty unique about COVID is, of course, the length of the disaster. In a tornado, the impact phase is very, very short, and then we have a very prolonged recovery phase, which we can see here. The impact phase is tiny. And what we're seeing with COVID is that our impact phase is actually really, really prolonged, which then stretches everything else out. And you can see here that around the first anniversary is where we start to see reconstruction for a typical disaster. Now we're past the first anniversary. And while I think we're all ready for COVID to go away and for us all to get back to our lives, when we look at public health, what we're seeing is we're still really deeply in the disaster. So this is a really, really prolonged period of disillusionment for most of us, and that has its impacts on our health. So before we talk too much about the health impacts, we're going to talk about neurochemistry a little bit. And I'm sorry, I'm going to give you the really brief overview of it. So when we experience a stressful event, the amygdala, which is the part of our brain that's responsible for emotional processing, sends a distress signal to the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus regulates our nervous system. It handles our body temperature, our blood pressure, heart rate, hormones, digestion, perspiration. So the hypothalamus communicates with the nervous system, and that preps our bodies for the fight or flight response. And our nervous system responds. So our heart rate increases, we begin to sweat, our blood pressure rises, and then our body releases cortisol to restore the energy that's lost in that physiological response. Cortisol is the primary stress hormone. What it does is it increases sugars in the bloodstream, and that gives our body extra resources to draw on for that initial response, and then helps with tissue repair afterwards. When the stressful event's over, cortisol level drops, everything regulates out. In an ongoing stressful event, the body produces more cortisol than we can use. And high levels of cortisol actually impact our brain's ability to function properly. So chronic cortisol overload can disrupt synapse regulation, which, without getting too heavily into neuroscience here, effectively when our synapses are disrupted, we lose our sociability and we become irritable. So if you think about how when you're stressed about something, sometimes you'll just snap at someone even when they're just trying to help or they're not even really involved in the situation that you're stressed with. That's synapse disruption. Chronic cortisol overload can also kill brain cells, and it can even reduce the size of our brain. Chronic stress can shrink our prefrontal cortex, which handles our working memory function and our ability to process information, and it increases the size of the amygdala. So knowing that the amygdala is responsible for emotional response, what we see here is that chronic stress actually makes us more susceptible to stress, which seems like a really cruel joke on the part of the body. So one thing I hear a lot from people is, but I wasn't affected. I don't understand why I feel this way. And there's a number of reasons for that. But the first one is that our brains have a really difficult time telling a real imminent threat from a perceived threat. So I'm going to give you a couple examples of that. If you've ever been home alone at night and you're watching a movie or a show that turns out to be scarier than you thought when you turned it on. So it ends, and even though you know that you were just watching a movie and it's not a real threat, you still feel uneasy. You check the doors locked before you go to bed. You close the blinds. And if the movie was really scary and you're me, you might check behind the shower curtain before you brush your teeth. Or let's think about nightmare. You wake up from a nightmare and your heart's racing, you're sweating, your blood pressure's through the roof. And even though you know immediately that it was just a dream, it still takes some time for you to calm down and for everything to regulate out. So that physical reaction, that increased heart rate, that sweating, it's caused by your brain releasing cortisol like the nightmare was a real threat. So even if we've been lucky and we've avoided most of the impacts of COVID-19 to ourselves, so let's say that we kept our jobs, everyone we love stayed healthy and nothing too much in our lives changed, we've still been living under really stressful conditions. We've been hearing about suffering and loss and reading about it, and we're seeing people in our communities impacted by it. And our brains are just as impacted by this stress as they would be by these impacts actually happening to us. So let's talk about how our brains are impacted. We're going to talk about cognitive impacts first of all, because we know that chronic stress changes our brain. These can commonly include, this is not a comprehensive list, but it can commonly include distressing dreams and nightmares, intrusive thoughts and images, difficulty concentrating, difficulty remembering things, difficulty making decisions, and a preoccupation with death and destruction. And I'm going to call out a couple of these here. I'm going to call out the difficulty concentrating, difficulty remembering things, and difficulty with decision making. So what we're seeing actually is there's an increase in what we're calling COVID brain fog, with people sort of saying that they're losing track of their thoughts in the middle of a sentence. And they can't remember things and they can't remember words and they feel like they're just in a fog. So if we think back to our neuroscience lecture just a minute ago, the part of our brain that is handling our memory and our decision-making abilities is our prefrontal cortex, which shrinks when it's subjected to chronic stress. So if, like many of us, myself included, that you find yourself standing in your kitchen looking at your dishwasher and you cannot remember the word for a dishwasher, or you're finding that you're having to set reminders for things that used to be second nature, it's not that you've suddenly dropped IQ points. Your brain is reacting to chronic stress. And of course, we don't just have cognitive impacts. We're going to talk about all of the other responses here. So we're going to start with behavioral responses, and these can include extreme change in activity levels, excessive drug or alcohol use, isolation or withdrawal, feeling on guard or hypervigilant, feeling agitated or shaky, violent or dangerous behavior, and for kids acting younger than their age. We have emotional responses, which can include sadness and tearfulness, being irritable or angry, feeling anxious or fearful, despair or hopelessness, feelings of guilt and shame, feeling numb or disconnected. And we have physical responses, and these include headaches, stomach problems, difficulty with sleep, whether that's sleeping too much or sleeping too little, eating problems, whether that's eating too much or eating too little, worsening of existing health problems, and fatigue and exhaustion. So if we think about a bingo card of common disaster responses, I think many of us can sit here and think, yeah, I've checked off a few of those over the last year. And that's because these are really, really common reactions to being subjected to intensely stressful situations. But maybe you're sitting there thinking, no, I'm okay. I can't relate to any of this. Why are some people more affected than others? And there's a lot of risk factors that increase someone's likelihood of a severe disaster reaction. This is not a comprehensive list, to be very clear. This is just some of the most likely ones. Death or injury of a loved one. And I'm using the word injury here deliberately. So while of course COVID has physical impacts for people, I've chosen the word injury to encompass other types of damage, since we know that while COVID's an illness, it has had major repercussions outside of the disease itself. So we're not just talking about physical illness, we're talking about financial injury and emotional injury as well here. Witnessing death or injury. We're seeing this a lot in our first responder and our caregiving population. Life was threatened, either yourself or a loved one. Major financial loss. Unemployment due to the disaster. A prolonged separation from your family. And again, when we're talking about our first responders and our caregiving populations, Especially early in the pandemic, before we knew a lot of people moved out of their homes if they had high-risk family members to protect them. And that prolonged separation from family is a risk factor. Having to change schools. Well, I think pretty much every child in the school had to, every child in the state had to change schools, whether they went from physical school to going to school at the dining room table. Being displaced from your home, having pre-existing disabilities, a history of previous trauma, and having past substance use or mental health conditions. So these all make it more likely that someone is going to have a severe reaction to the disaster. Well, great. Now what? So we've just talked about all the ways we're impacted by this. We've talked about how our prefrontal cortex is shrinking and how we're irritable and we're having headaches and we're eating too much. So great. Now what? Here's the good news. Most of the time, these reactions are temporary and they will go away on their own. Very few people see effects more than a few months after the disaster. And there are techniques we can use to help with them. Practicing a good self-care routine. We talked about self-care a couple of weeks ago. Practicing a good self-care routine encompasses the multiple aspects of self-care. So that's physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, and social. Building a good self-care routine helps balance some of these reactions. Mild or moderate exercise. And I'm calling this out here because we've talked about cortisol overload. And mild or moderate exercise is one of the things that helps with chronic cortisol overload. Breathing techniques, mindfulness and meditation, and talking about it. Normalization is very, very helpful. I've been seeing a lot of newspaper articles coming out about how it's not you, it's pandemic. And those are so helpful. So talking about, oh yeah, I'm having this reaction, it's because I'm under stress, can help normalize things for other people as well. What do you do if you need more help? Severe reactions to disaster can happen and they may require further intervention. If your symptoms are severe, if you're very distressed by them, or if you're displaying some of the more concerning symptoms, things like an increase in substance use or violent behavior, or if you're feeling like your anger is out of control, seeking professional help is crucial. Utilize your EAP through your work. Ask your primary care physician for a referral to a counsellor, or you can call Project Renew and we'll help you find resources in your area. I've called out a couple of phone numbers over here on the side. Project Renew, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, and the SAMHSA Disaster Distress Helpline. Help is here. So, does anyone have any questions, any thoughts, any feedback here? And we've got a small enough group you can just unmute yourself if you need to.
So hi, this is Jill. And two questions. So right now I'm originally from the Twin Cities, and the most recent disaster there is that is my whole backyard. My cousin is living there right now, and what I'm struggling with are multiple disasters, right? And so it's hard to go back home because there's a lot more crime, there's a lot of social unrest, and there's COVID. So it's this layered, it's like archaeology, and it's just like, it's so intense. And then people are like so much meaner to each other than they ever used to be. I don't care if it's like, wear a mask, don't wear a mask, get a vaccine, don't get a vaccine, but people are just bitchy as hell right now. And it's really unhelpful. And the other thing, are there free resources? Because my Blue Cross, they are ending all of their telehealth, May 1st, they're ending the copay and co-share help that they've been doing the whole disaster. And I have a $7,000 deductible and I'm not working. So I can find resources, but I can't pay for them. And they were paid for. And I feel like it being dropped on my head in the middle of a disaster. Thank you, Blue Cross North Dakota. So those are my two things, the
Yes.
layered, like multiple things happening all at once. And then what kind of, are there free resources? Thank you.
Yes. So the multiple layers of trauma and disaster, absolutely. And it's having the severe reactions then are completely common. I'm not going to use the word normal because none of this is normal, but they are very, very common. And Jill, I will connect with you after this to try and get you hooked up with some resources as well, okay?
Thank you.
Anyone else have any questions? Okay. If no one else has any questions, I will stop sharing and I will stop the recording and everyone is